Were easy American dinner recipes from the 1950s really this simple and comforting? These dinners filled family tables with casseroles, meat and potatoes, and quick one-pan meals that kept households fed on busy nights. What do we uncover about that decade and ourselves when we taste them again? Creamed chipped salmon on toast was a thrifty mid-century twist on the more familiar chipped beef, made with canned salmon that was both affordable and shelf-stable. Housewives opened a can, stirred the fish into a creamy white sauce made with milk and flour, and poured it over slices of toasted bread. It was quick, filling, and dependable, especially for families trying to stretch budgets while still putting something warm on the table. The mild flavor of salmon worked well with the sauce, turning plain pantry ingredients into a dish that felt hearty and even a little special. Children often ate it without fuss, since the creamy texture made it smooth and comforting. Adults appreciated that it was inexpensive but still felt like a proper dinner. Diners and lunch counters also served versions of it, making it a recognizable comfort food across communities. Creamed chipped salmon on toast stood as proof of the 1950s ability to take canned goods and transform them into meals that could satisfy families at the end of a long day. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and tomato sauce were one of the most colorful and practical dinners of the 1950s, turning simple ingredients into a family feast. Green bell peppers were hollowed out, filled with a mixture of rice, ground beef, and onion, and then topped with tangy tomato sauce. Housewives loved this recipe because it was flexible. Leftover rice or vegetables could be worked in to stretch the filling further. Children liked the novelty of eating food served inside a vegetable, while adults appreciated its hearty taste. The peppers baked slowly in the oven, filling kitchens with a savory aroma that promised a warm meal. Many community cookbooks highlighted stuffed peppers as a reliable option for busy weeknights or potluck gatherings. The dish reflected the balance of thrift and presentation that defined mid-century cooking, using inexpensive staples in a way that looked impressive. Stuffed bell peppers became a dinner table favorite because they were nourishing, frugal, and just different enough to feel special without costing much at all. Turkey tetrazzini bake was a perfect solution for leftovers, a creamy casserole that turned Sunday's roast into Monday's dinner. Chunks of turkey were combined with mushrooms, peas, and pasta, all mixed in a white sauce and baked until bubbly. Housewives turned to it after holidays, when leftover turkey needed to be used before it spoiled. Children loved the creamy texture and cheesy topping, which transformed what might have been a tired leftover into something new. The dish also carried a sense of elegance, since tetrazzini recipes had originally been associated with restaurant cooking. By the 1950s, cookbooks adapted it for everyday households, simplifying the method but keeping the comforting taste. It reflected the post-war love of casseroles, which combined thrift with convenience. Families found that turkey tetrazzini could stretch a small amount of meat into a full dinner, feeding many without extra cost. It was hearty, warm, and dependable, the kind of dish that filled bellies while still carrying a touch of mid-century sophistication. Meatball and onion gravy skillet was one of the most comforting one-pan meals of the 1950s, made with inexpensive ground beef rolled into meatballs and simmered in brown gravy with onions. Housewives loved it because it required only a handful of ingredients yet tasted filling and satisfying. Served over mashed potatoes or bread, it became a complete dinner that could feed an entire family without stretching the budget too far. Children enjoyed the rich flavor of the gravy, which made even plain mashed potatoes taste special. Adults appreciated the way this dish transformed economical ground beef into something hearty and flavorful. Cookbooks often recommended it as a weeknight staple, since it could be made quickly on the stovetop without heating the oven. The meatball skillet reflected the practicality of mid-century cooking, which emphasized resourceful ways to feed families well. For many, it became a familiar part of the dinner table, a simple but memorable dish that carried both comfort and thrift in every bite. Cabbage roll casserole was a staple of frugal cooking, turning ground meat and rice into a filling dinner wrapped in cabbage leaves. Housewives layered seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage, rolled it tightly, and baked the bundles in tomato sauce. The dish was practical because cabbage was inexpensive and abundant, especially from backyard gardens. Children were sometimes hesitant at first, but the rich tomato sauce and savory filling won them over. Adults appreciated the satisfying flavor and the fact that a little meat went a long way when paired with rice and vegetables. It also became popular at community suppers and church potlucks, where its hearty portions made it easy to share. Many cookbooks of the 1950s included cabbage rolls as an example of thrifty yet wholesome cooking. The casserole reflected the post-war trend of stretching ingredients creatively, turning humble produce into a centerpiece meal. Cabbage roll casserole proved that practical cooking could also carry comfort and tradition, nourishing families without unnecessary expense. Shepherd's pie with canned vegetables was a thrifty adaptation of a classic dish, using pantry staples to create something hearty and filling. Ground beef was cooked with onions, then combined with canned peas, carrots, or corn before being topped with mashed potatoes. Housewives appreciated that it could be assembled quickly with whatever ingredients were on hand. The topping of mashed potatoes turned it into a full meal, stretching a small amount of meat across several servings. Children liked it because the familiar flavors blended together smoothly, making vegetables easier to eat. Adults valued it as a reliable dish that could be made in large batches, perfect for busy households. By the 1950s, shepherd's pie was firmly established as a comfort food in America, and the canned vegetables made it accessible to all families. It reflected the practicality of mid-century cooking, showing how convenience foods could keep traditions alive while still saving money. For many families, shepherd's pie became a dependable weekly dinner. Pork chop with apples and onions was one of the most beloved sweet and savory pairings of the 1950s, frequently appearing in community cookbooks. Housewives pan-fried pork chops until golden, then simmered them with sliced apples and onions for a flavorful contrast. The apples softened into sweetness, while the onions added depth, creating a balanced dish that felt both rustic and refined. Children often enjoyed the sweet notes of the apples, which made the meal more appealing. Adults appreciated its simplicity and the way it elevated an inexpensive cut of pork into something memorable. It became a fall favorite, especially when apples were in season and easy to find. The dish reflected the era's tendency to blend fruit with meats, creating combinations that felt home-style yet slightly special. Pork chop with apples and onions stood out as an example of how American families in the 1950s used seasonal ingredients to create comforting meals that could stretch budgets without sacrificing flavor. Macaroni and tomato hot dish was a simple but hearty baked meal that made regular appearances on 1950s dinner tables. Elbow macaroni was boiled, then combined with canned tomatoes, onions, and cheese before being baked until bubbly. Housewives relied on this dish because it required only inexpensive pantry staples, yet could feed large families. Children enjoyed the cheesy pasta, which was familiar and comforting, while the tang of tomato added a new flavor dimension. Adults appreciated that it was both affordable and filling, especially during busy weeknights. Many church cookbooks featured versions of macaroni hot dish, each family adding its own twist with extra spices or breadcrumbs. It reflected the casserole craze of the mid-century, where simple combinations of starch, sauce, and cheese became beloved staples. Macaroni and tomato hot dish captured the essence of 1950s cooking, economical, convenient, and satisfying without being fussy. For many, it was the definition of everyday comfort food. Creamed chicken over rice was one of the richest but most practical dinners served in the 1950s, making use of milk, flour, and a small portion of chicken. Housewives cooked chicken pieces in a creamy white sauce, stretching a little meat into a dish that could feed many. Served over rice, it became a filling meal that was both comforting and economical. Children enjoyed its smooth, mild flavor, which felt indulgent compared to plainer dishes. Adults appreciated the warmth and heartiness it brought to the dinner table, especially in colder months. Diners and cafeterias also served versions of creamed chicken, showing how widespread and beloved it became. It represented the mid-century style of cooking that relied on basic ingredients but transformed them through technique and thrift. Creamed chicken over rice was practical, budget-friendly, and full of nostalgia for families who grew up with its creamy taste and simple presentation on weekday evenings. Stuffed meatloaf with hard-boiled eggs was a showpiece dinner that remained budget-friendly while adding visual appeal. Housewives prepared the meatloaf mixture of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasonings, then placed hard-boiled eggs in the center before baking. When sliced, each portion revealed a striking cross-section with egg in the middle, making it both practical and eye-catching. Children enjoyed the surprise of seeing eggs inside their meatloaf, while adults appreciated the creativity of the dish. Despite its flair, it used only inexpensive ingredients, keeping it accessible to families watching their budgets. Community cookbooks often promoted it as a recipe that could impress guests without requiring expensive cuts of meat. It reflected the era's love for presentation, where even everyday meals were arranged to look appealing. Stuffed meatloaf with eggs stood as proof that thrift and creativity could go hand in hand, giving families a dinner centerpiece that felt special without costing much. Beef and cabbage hot dish was the kind of recipe that felt both hearty and thrifty, the very definition of mid-century practicality. Housewives browned ground beef with onions, layered it with chopped cabbage, and baked it all together in a simple tomato base. The result was a filling casserole that stretched a pound of meat into enough servings to feed a hungry family. Children often wrinkled their noses at the sight of cabbage, but once it baked down with the beef and sauce, it became sweet and tender, blending smoothly with the other flavors. Adults appreciated how nourishing it was, providing both protein and vegetables in one easy pan. Church cookbooks of the 1950s often featured variations of this dish, reflecting its popularity across communities. It was affordable, convenient, and required only pantry staples, making it a dependable weeknight choice. Beef and cabbage hot dish was not glamorous, but it embodied the resourcefulness of the decade, keeping families satisfied on limited budgets while still delivering the warmth of a home-cooked meal. Oven-baked cod with Ritz cracker topping was a beloved fish dinner that felt indulgent without straining wallets. Fresh cod was placed in a baking dish, topped with crushed Ritz crackers mixed with butter and baked until golden and crisp. Housewives turned to this recipe when they wanted to serve seafood that looked elegant but required little effort. Children loved the crunchy topping, which masked the mild taste of the fish and made it more appealing. Adults appreciated the balance of thrift and presentation, since cod was affordable compared to other fish and crackers were always on hand. Community suppers often showcased this dish because it was easy to prepare in large batches while still impressing guests. It carried the comfort of baked casseroles while also hinting at sophistication, especially for families far from the coast who still wanted seafood on the table. Oven-baked cod with Ritz cracker topping stood as a perfect example of 1950s creativity, elevating basic ingredients into something memorable and satisfying. Hot dog casserole with noodles was one of those simple 1950s creations that turned an inexpensive ingredient into a family favorite. Housewives sliced hot dogs into coins, stirred them into a creamy noodle mixture, and baked everything together until bubbling. It was an economical way to stretch a package of hot dogs into a full dinner, feeding several mouths with minimal cost. Children were delighted by the playful mix of pasta and sausage, while adults found it practical for busy evenings. It reflected the mid-century fascination with casseroles, where anything could be combined in one dish to save time and money. Many community cookbooks featured versions of hot dog casseroles, each household adding their own twist with cheese, peas, or breadcrumbs. The dish carried a sense of fun while also being grounded in thrift, making it one of the more memorable examples of resourceful cooking. Hot dog casserole with noodles captured the spirit of the 1950s kitchen: creative, frugal, and unashamedly comforting. Baked ham with mustard brown sugar glaze was the centerpiece of countless 1950s holiday tables, serving as both a celebratory dinner and a source of days' worth of leftovers. Housewives coated the ham in a glaze made from mustard and brown sugar, baking it until the surface caramelized into a sweet, tangy crust. The aroma alone filled homes with anticipation. Children loved the sugary glaze, while adults appreciated how the ham could be sliced thin for sandwiches or diced into casseroles after the feast. It was practical luxury, a dish that felt festive without being wasteful. Many families associated it with Christmas, Easter, or Sunday gatherings, when extended relatives came together around the table. Cookbooks and advertisements often promoted glazed ham as a symbol of prosperity in the post-war years. Baked ham with mustard-brown sugar glaze became an enduring tradition of the 1950s, embodying both the celebratory spirit of the era and the resourceful mindset that ensured nothing went to waste. Scalloped corn casserole was a creamy, comforting side that often doubled as the main dish when money was tight. Housewives mixed canned corn with eggs, milk, and crushed crackers, then baked it until golden and firm. It was inexpensive yet filling, the kind of recipe that stretched basic pantry goods into something that felt hearty. Children loved its pudding-like texture, while adults valued its versatility since it paired well with almost any protein. At church suppers and family gatherings, scalloped corn was a dependable contribution, always disappearing quickly from the table. Cookbooks of the 1950s frequently listed it as a way to transform canned vegetables into something more appealing. The dish reflected the growing reliance on convenience foods while still keeping ties to traditional comfort cooking. Scalloped corn casserole was proof that simple ingredients could yield a dish rich in nostalgia, embodying the resourcefulness and communal spirit that defined mid-century American kitchens. Ground beef. Spanish rice was a mid-century favorite that showed how much Americans were fascinated by what they considered exotic flavors. Ground beef was cooked with onions, garlic, canned tomatoes, and rice, seasoned with chili powder or paprika for a mild heat. It was simple to prepare, yet carried a flavor profile different from the standard meat and potato dinners of the time. Children found it tasty and filling, while adults enjoyed the novelty of something that seemed worldly without being complicated. Housewives appreciated how a small amount of beef could be stretched with rice to create several servings, making it both thrifty and practical. Many 1950s community cookbooks featured Spanish rice as a staple recipe, reflecting its popularity across the country. It reflected both curiosity and restraint, delivering just enough spice to feel adventurous while still keeping the dish approachable for every family member. Ground beef Spanish rice captured the way mid-century America experimented with new tastes while holding firmly to the values of thrift and convenience. Cabbage and noodle skillet, often called haluski style, was a dish that showed the strong influence of immigrant traditions on mid-century American cooking. Housewives fried chopped cabbage in butter until tender and slightly sweet, then tossed it with noodles and onions. It was incredibly simple yet surprisingly hearty, providing comfort with only a few inexpensive ingredients. Children enjoyed the mild taste, while adults appreciated how filling and affordable it was. The dish often appeared at church suppers in areas with large Eastern European communities, eventually spreading into broader American cooking. It represented the way immigrant recipes blended seamlessly into mid-century kitchens, becoming everyday staples. Housewives leaned on it when money was scarce, since cabbage and noodles could be bought cheaply and stretched across several meals. Cabbage and noodle skillet was proof that even the humblest foods could carry warmth, tradition, and satisfaction, making it a quiet but memorable part of 1950s dinner tables. Sloppy Joe supper became a sensation in the 1950s, combining ground beef with tangy tomato-based sauce and serving it over bread or buns. Housewives loved how quick and inexpensive it was, turning 1 pound of beef into several sandwiches with ease. Children adored the messy, saucy sandwiches, often making them a requested favorite. Adults appreciated the bold flavor, a break from plainer meat dishes of the time. Community cookbooks spread countless versions of Sloppy Joes, from highly spiced to sweet and mild. They were equally at home on weeknight dinner tables and at church gatherings, where large batches could be served with little effort. The dish reflected the mid-century love of casual, hearty meals that balanced thrift with fun. Sloppy Joes were affordable, versatile, and comforting, perfectly suited for a growing suburban culture. Sloppy Joe supper was more than just a sandwich. It became a cultural marker of 1950s kitchens, remembered fondly for its taste and its cheerful messiness. Oven-baked drumsticks with paprika were one of the most approachable poultry dinners of the 1950s, offering flavor and affordability in every bite. Housewives coated chicken drumsticks with paprika and seasonings, then baked them until crisp on the outside and juicy inside. It was an easy recipe that delivered consistent results, even for busy families. Children loved picking up drumsticks with their hands, while adults appreciated that chicken was cheaper than beef or pork. The paprika provided a warm, smoky flavor that elevated a simple meal into something more memorable. Community cookbooks often listed baked chicken recipes as weeknight staples, and this version became a favorite for its balance of cost and taste. Drumsticks were often served with mashed potatoes or green beans, completing the kind of dinner that defined mid-century kitchens. Oven-baked drumsticks with paprika captured the essence of 1950s family cooking. Straightforward, budget-friendly, and deeply satisfying. Creamed tuna and peas over biscuits was a classic example of stretching canned goods into a full dinner. Housewives stirred canned tuna with peas in a creamy white sauce, then spooned it generously over fresh-baked biscuits. It was inexpensive yet hearty, the kind of meal that filled stomachs without requiring much meat. Children often enjoyed the mild, creamy flavor, while adults valued its practicality, especially on busy nights. The dish was a natural extension of wartime cooking habits when resourcefulness was necessary, and it carried into the 1950s as a dependable standby. Community cookbooks and pamphlets promoted versions of creamed tuna as ways to save money while still offering warmth and comfort. It reflected the reliance on pantry staples like canned fish and vegetables, staples that became central to mid-century home cooking. Creamed tuna and peas over biscuits proved that frugality could still bring families together around the table, leaving memories of meals that were simple yet comforting. Cheesy potato and ham casserole was one of the most dependable dishes of the 1950s, born out of the need to stretch leftovers into something hearty. Housewives layered thin slices of potato with bits of leftover ham, pouring a creamy cheese sauce over the top before baking it to bubbling perfection. The dish was warm, filling, and economical, transforming scraps from Sunday dinner into a satisfying family meal during the week. Children loved the gooey cheese and tender potatoes, while adults appreciated how the dish managed to feel indulgent without requiring expensive ingredients. It became especially popular at church suppers and community potlucks, where it was easy to prepare in large pans and guaranteed to disappear quickly. Cookbooks often listed variations, sometimes swapping in onions or peas, showing its versatility across households. The cheesy potato and ham casserole perfectly embodied the balance of thrift and comfort that defined mid-century kitchens, offering nourishment, flavor, and nostalgia in one practical dish. Meatloaf muffins with ketchup topping were a clever mid-century spin on a household staple, turning a large loaf into smaller, portion-controlled servings. Housewives mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs and seasonings, then pressed the mixture into muffin tins before baking. Each little meatloaf was topped with ketchup, which caramelized as it cooked, creating a sweet, tangy glaze. Families loved the novelty of the miniature servings, especially children who thought they were fun to eat. Adults appreciated the convenience, since the smaller portions cooked faster and made for easy leftovers. This recipe fit perfectly into the 1950s casserole craze, where presentation and efficiency mattered as much as thrift. They were also ideal for lunchboxes or quick reheating on busy evenings. Meatloaf muffins with ketchup topping captured the creativity of the era, proving that even familiar dishes could be reshaped into something practical, appealing, and memorable for families gathered around the dinner table. Chicken fricassee with dumplings was a frugal yet comforting dish that stretched poultry into a full family meal. Housewives simmered chicken pieces in a light gravy, then dropped flour dumplings into the pot to soak up the flavor. The dumplings were inexpensive to make but filling, turning a few cuts of chicken into enough servings for everyone. Children enjoyed the soft, pillowy dumplings, while adults valued how the meal was both hearty and practical. It was the kind of recipe that worked well during leaner weeks, when a single bird had to last across several dinners. Cookbooks of the 1950s often promoted fricassee as a balanced option, pairing protein with starch in one pot. Community gatherings also embraced it, since the dish could be stretched easily by increasing the number of dumplings. Chicken fricassee with dumplings stood as an example of resourcefulness, showing how simple ingredients could become a meal that felt complete comforting, and satisfying without requiring much expense. Corned beef and potato hash supper was a skillet meal rooted in practicality, often made with canned corned beef left over from wartime habits. Housewives diced potatoes, onions, and corned beef, frying everything together until crisp on the edges. It was inexpensive, quick, and filling, the kind of dinner that could be made on a busy weeknight with whatever was already in the pantry. Children enjoyed the salty, hearty flavor, while adults appreciated that it made good use of shelf-stable ingredients. It was especially popular in working-class households, where stretching canned meat was a necessity. Cookbooks frequently listed hash suppers as versatile dishes that could adapt to whatever vegetables were on hand. Served with eggs or bread, it became a complete meal that carried both comfort and thrift. Corned beef and potato hash supper captured the ingenuity of 1950s kitchens, where leftovers and pantry staples were never wasted, but instead transformed into dinners that filled stomachs and brought families together around the table. Spaghetti pie with cottage cheese was one of the more inventive dishes of the 1950s, turning a bowl of pasta into something resembling a savory pie. Housewives lined a pie pan with cooked spaghetti, then layered it with cottage cheese, tomato sauce, and sometimes ground beef before baking until firm. The finished dish could be sliced like a pie, creating tidy servings that were both fun and filling. Children loved the novelty of spaghetti presented in pie form, while adults appreciated its practicality. It was a clever way to repurpose leftover pasta into something that felt new and exciting. Cookbooks often highlighted it as a dish that combined Italian inspiration with American frugality, reflecting the decade's fascination with adapting ethnic flavors to family budgets. Spaghetti pie with cottage cheese represented the creativity of mid-century households, where presentation was as important as thrift. It became a memorable recipe of the era, balancing novelty, economy, and comfort all in one. Oven-fried pork cutlets offered families the crispy texture of fried meat without the mess or expense of deep frying. Housewives coated thin slices of pork in seasoned crumbs, placed them on baking sheets, and baked until golden. The result was tender meat with a crisp crust that felt indulgent yet practical. Children enjoyed the crunchy coating, while adults appreciated that the dish used inexpensive cuts of pork. It became especially popular in community cookbooks, where recipes emphasized thrift and convenience. Oven frying also fit neatly into the mid-century shift toward efficiency in the kitchen, as busy families embraced quicker, cleaner methods. Served with mashed potatoes or vegetables, oven-fried pork cutlets made for a complete meal that was easy to prepare on a weeknight. The dish reflected the balance of comfort and practicality that defined 1950s cooking, showing how everyday ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying without stretching the household budget. Vegetable beef soup supper was a hearty, economical dinner that stretched scraps and bones into a pot large enough to feed the entire family. Housewives simmered beef bones with onions, carrots, and potatoes, often tossing in any leftover vegetables from the week. The long simmering brought rich flavor, while the vegetables made it filling and nutritious. Children loved dipping bread into the broth, while adults valued how a single pot could last across multiple meals. It was also a social dish, appearing frequently at church suppers and community gatherings where large pots could feed crowds. Cookbooks emphasized its thrift, noting how bones and scraps could be used effectively instead of wasted. The soup reflected the enduring influence of Depression-era habits on 1950s cooking, where resourcefulness remained central. Vegetable beef soup supper was more than just a meal. It was a tradition of gathering around a pot that symbolized thrift, warmth, and the communal spirit of mid-century America. Cheese soufflé casserole was a lighter dinner option that carried an air of sophistication, popularized by women's magazines of the 1950s. Housewives beat eggs with milk and cheese, baking the mixture until it puffed and turned golden. It was inexpensive yet presented beautifully, making it a favorite for luncheons or dinner parties. Children liked the airy texture, while adults saw it as a refined alternative to heavier casseroles. It also reflected the era's fascination with French-influenced cooking, which was often adapted for American kitchens. Cookbooks promoted soufflé casseroles as impressive dishes that did not require costly ingredients. They offered homemakers the chance to serve something elegant while still respecting household budgets. The cheese soufflé casserole embodied the balance of thrift and aspiration that defined the decade, turning simple pantry items into a dish that looked far more extravagant than it really was. It became a symbol of how presentation and creativity mattered as much as taste in mid-century kitchens. Skillet sausage with potatoes and peppers was a one-pan wonder that brought bold flavor to the dinner table without stretching the grocery bill. Housewives sliced sausage links thin, frying them with diced potatoes and colorful peppers until everything was browned and tender. The result was hearty, colorful, and quick to prepare, perfect for busy evenings. Children loved the mix of textures, while adults appreciated how the dish stretched a small amount of sausage across several servings. It was a practical recipe that combined thrift with satisfying taste, proving that even modest portions of meat could anchor a full meal. Community cookbooks often promoted this dish as a dependable option for weeknights, since it used ingredients most households already had on hand. It reflected the 1950s trend towards simple, filling dinners that could be prepared with minimal fuss. Skillet sausage with potatoes and peppers stood out as a flavorful reminder of how mid-century kitchens made the most of every ingredient. Chicken and mushroom cream bake was one of the many dishes that showcased the growing reliance on canned soups in 1950s kitchens. Housewives layered chicken pieces with canned mushroom soup and baked everything together until creamy and tender. The result was a rich, satisfying dinner that felt indulgent without requiring complicated preparation. Children enjoyed the smooth, savory sauce, while adults valued its convenience and affordability. The use of canned soup made the dish quick to prepare, fitting neatly into the post-war embrace of modern convenience foods. Community cookbooks and advertisements promoted recipes like this as symbols of efficiency and comfort. It reflected the era's tendency to blend practicality with indulgence, making the most of pantry staples while still delivering satisfying meals. Chicken and mushroom cream bake became one of the quintessential 1950s dinners, remembered fondly as a dish that combined thrift, convenience, and comfort in one creamy, crowd-pleasing casserole. Fried green tomato and onion sandwiches with mustard butter were what you made when the tomatoes refused to ripen. Green, firm, and tart, they were sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden. The onions, sweet and sharp, were grilled or pan-seared until soft, then layered on top. But the secret weapon was the mustard butter, a mix of softened butter, spicy mustard, and sometimes a pinch of sugar spread thick on toasted bread. This sandwich was loud, crispy, tangy, creamy, and bold. It was also a meal of defiance, a way to eat what was ready rather than wait for perfection. In farm kitchens, that kind of thinking was survival. You worked with what was in your hands. Green tomatoes have mostly become a novelty now, but back then, they were dinner. And this sandwich, messy, crunchy, unforgettable, was proof that sour could still satisfy. Canned chicken hash was how you made a hot, filling dinner happen when all you had was pantry scraps and a few minutes to spare. You popped open a can of shredded chicken, fried it in a skillet with some chopped onions, and tossed in leftover mashed potatoes or canned potatoes if you had them. Everything crisped up around the edges, browned in the pan, and came together into something that looked decent and filled your stomach fast. Old cookbooks leaned hard on meals like this because they were cheap, quick, and made sure nothing went to waste. Chicken hash might not sound glamorous, but in homes where leftovers were gold, it was a lifesaver. You could top it with a fried egg or spoon a little gravy over it if you were lucky, but most folks ate it just as it was, hot, salty, and good enough to count. This was dinner that made the best of what you had. And back in those days, that meant everything. Funny how meals like this stuck around even when fancier options showed up. Sometimes the fast, familiar ones were the best. Not every seafood dish came from the ocean. Some came straight from a can. In a time when fresh shrimp was a luxury for coastal towns, canned shrimp offered an affordable way for working-class families to bring a little seafood into their diets. Mixed with peas in a thick, creamy white sauce and served over crackers or toast, This dish had a playful name, shrimp wiggle, but it was all business when it came to stretching ingredients. Canned shrimp had been around since the early 20th century, marketed as a convenient alternative to fresh shellfish. By the 1960s, it found its way into all kinds of home-cooked meals, from salads to casseroles. In this dish, it was combined with a simple white sauce, a budget-friendly staple made from butter, flour, and milk that turned just about anything into a filling, stick-to-your-ribs meal. The peas added a pop of color and a bit of sweetness, balancing out the richness of the sauce. Served over saltines or toasted white bread, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting, and familiar. For many kids, it was their first introduction to seafood, whether they liked it or not. Some remember it fondly, while others never quite warmed up to the idea of shrimp that came from a can. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles, and maple syrup. Another one you might be surprised to see in a video about medieval-era recipes is honey and oat cakes. Oats were really common in northern and western regions like Ireland, Scandinavia, and Scotland, and this was because the climate was really cold. It was much easier to grow them than, let's say, wheat. Oats were something that would thrive in poor soils, and they also had shorter growing seasons, which meant that they became a pristine source of food when times were tough and you were running low in your pantry. A very basic oat cake would typically be made from coarsely ground oatmeal, water, and some salt, and this mix would be made into a slightly hard dough, rolled very thin, and then cooked on a baking stone. These were durable, portable, and crispy, so they were the perfect meal for long journeys. Alongside some honey, which was the primary sweetener before sugar, it was one of the best meals you could have for celebrations. While people did use them in their daily lives, rural peasants most often got to enjoy them during festivals and religious holidays in monasteries. It's also interesting to note that honey was seen as a bounty of the earth that carried divine favor, and so honey and oat cakes were seen as a good blessing for wedding feasts. Chicken feet and dumplings with collard green broth made sure nothing went to waste. Every part of the bird was used, and the feet, once cleaned and simmered, released a gelatin that thickened the soup and made it silky. The dumplings were flour and fat, dropped by spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, soaking up all the flavor like sponges of survival. The broth was built on collard greens, wilted and steeped until they lent their earthiness to every bite. This was not a fancy dinner, it was a necessary one. In black farming communities across the South, this dish was standard, hearty, humble, and rich with culture. It was the kind of food that looked thin in the bowl but sat heavy in the belly. Today, we have forgotten the skill it takes to coax nourishment out of the neglected parts of the pantry. But this meal, Every last finger bone and dumpling was a lesson in gratitude, ingenuity, and care. Cheddar egg toast with pickle spears was proof that even with the bare minimum in your kitchen, you could still whip up a dinner that hit all the right notes. You started with plain sliced bread, cracked an egg over the top, sprinkled shredded cheddar cheese across the whole thing, and slid it under the broiler until the edges turned crisp and the cheese bubbled up. Add a pickle spear on the side, the sharper and brinier, the better, and suddenly dinner felt just a little more put together. This was the kind of meal that showed up in all those old spiral-bound cookbooks from the 1930s through the 70s. Fast, affordable, and surprisingly filling, it kept people going through lean years when even simple groceries felt like luxuries. Cheese, eggs, and bread might have been basic pantry staples, but when you combined them like this, it felt special enough to count. Families leaned on recipes like this because they worked. You could have dinner ready in under 10 minutes, and everyone stayed full. Those little meals did not need much, just heat, a little creativity, and whatever odds and ends you had lying around. Somehow, that was always enough. Though overshadowed by modern fast foods, quick chopped liver on rye endures as a testament to adaptability and rich culinary heritage. Historically, chopped liver found its niche in Eastern European Jewish homes, where families prized its affordability and robust nutritional profile. Even during times of scarcity, the recipe thrived, packing intense flavors into a straightforward package. With a ready-made liver spread slathered on dense rye, preparation becomes a breeze, sparing busy households from lengthy cooking sessions. Its smooth texture and savory notes contrast beautifully with the bread's satisfying crunch, lending each bite a subtle complexity that defies its simple construction. Many who sample this old favorite joke that it's a dish only a mother could love, but the punchline is in its enduring popularity across generations. Nutritional experts have long noted that organ meats supply essential vitamins, underscoring their practical value when shopping on a budget. By combining time-honored tradition with modern convenience, this dish proves that hearty meals needn't be complicated. Long before fancy nut butters dominated grocery aisles, a beloved combination of peanut butter and bananas reigned supreme in many American homes. Referred to fondly by some as the old-time peanut butter and banana sandwich, it gained traction in the mid-20th century as an affordable yet satisfying pick-me-up. Historians note that peanut butter became widely popularized in the United States in the early 1900s, while bananas, thanks to expanding imports, evolved into a household staple. This distinctive pairing offers both creamy consistency and a soft, subtly sweet bite that fuses into a delightfully nostalgic treat, promising convenience for busy families needing a quick snack. Some enthusiasts joke that the only challenging part is deciding whether to toast the bread, but the crucial element is the dreamy melding of textures. Accessibility, highlighted by easily sourced ingredients, underscores why the sandwich remains iconic despite changing food trends. It also provides a modest dose of potassium from bananas and protein from peanut butter, underscoring its practicality. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it Slumgullion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name Slumgullion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. The Hungarians really killed it with dinners that shaped our childhood, because we've got another banger on the list. Hungarian goulash was everyone's favorite cozy hearty meal back in the day. Goulash is a hearty stew whipped up with tender chunks of beef simmered in a rich, savory sauce brimming with paprika. Yeah, paprika was huge back in the day. So why did this delicious dinner vanish from our dinner tables? Well, the Hungarian goulash traces back as far as the 10th century to stews eaten by the shepherds, so you can say this one might just have run its course. But hey, if you're ever craving goulash, dust off some old cookbooks and get to work, because it really isn't hard to wump up. This is the perfect dish for a chilly night in, curled up on the couch with a good movie. Just be careful not to spill it on your mom's vintage tablecloth. Those things are irreplaceable. Curd cheese with herbs is a really good example of how even the simplest of ingredients and medieval-era foods could be turned into perfectly nice snacks or lunches. Curd cheese was also known as white cheese, and it wasn't like hard cheese. This one was much more readily available and quicker to make. You would curdle the milk with rennet and vinegar, and then you would drain all the way to leave a really soft and fresh curd. This was extremely common in households where dairy herds and weekly cheese making was done so that milk could be prevented from spoiling. Europe also, interestingly enough, had different names for this depending on what areas you would find yourself in. Places that largely spoke German, for example, would call it quark. It was known as brocue in certain parts of France. Also, in urban homes or wealthier ones, curd cheese would be made with spices and served with fruits for a nice little sweet and savory twist. For decades, stuffed bell peppers were a staple of the American dinner table. They were practical, inexpensive, and packed with flavor. Families in the mid-20th century relied on simple, hearty meals, and this dish delivered. With just a few basic ingredients, ground beef, rice, tomatoes, and a well-seasoned filling, home cooks could create a meal that was both satisfying and visually appealing. Peppers were an accessible ingredient, easy to grow in backyard gardens and cheap at the store. Their natural shape made them the perfect edible container, eliminating the need for extra cookware. The filling, often stretched with rice to make the meat go further, was an economical way to feed a large family on a budget. Baked until tender, the peppers absorbed the savory juices, creating a dish that was both rustic and comforting. But as convenience foods took over, stuffed peppers began to fade from dinner rotations. The rise of prepackaged meals and fast food options meant fewer people were willing to spend time hollowing out peppers and slow baking a homemade filling. Today, the dish still makes an occasional appearance in nostalgic cookbooks, but it's no longer a household staple. In the Appalachian Mountains, resourcefulness was a way of life. When fresh food wasn't always guaranteed, families learned how to make the most of what they had, and that's where soured corn soup came in. This dish started with dried corn that had been left to ferment slightly, giving it a tangy depth of flavor. Simmered with onions and a chunk of fatback, it transformed into a rich, hearty soup that was as practical as it was unique. Corn was the backbone of Appalachian cooking, grown in backyard gardens and stored for winter months. Allowing it to sour slightly wasn't a mistake. It was a method passed down for generations, a natural way to enhance flavor when refrigeration wasn't an option. Fatback, a common cut of cured pork, added just enough richness to make the dish feel substantial, while onions provided a little sweetness to balance out the tang. This wasn't the kind of soup you'd find in a restaurant, but for mountain families, it was a familiar and comforting meal. Some grew up eating it with cornbread on the side, others with a spoon straight from the pot. Quick potato flake pancakes were one of those practical, budget dinners born from the back of old pantry shelves. You grabbed a box of instant potato flakes, mixed them with water and a little egg if you had it, then shaped the dough into small pancakes and fried them up in butter. That was dinner. It came together in 10 minutes flat and filled you up with simple, salty, crispy goodness. These pancakes were a staple of old cookbooks that loved pantry meals you could make fast with whatever was on hand. No peeling, no mashing, no waiting for potatoes to boil, just flakes, water, and a hot skillet. You could add herbs or cheese to dress them up, but most families kept it simple. They were crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and filled your plate without much effort. This was dinner that made the best of tight grocery budgets and busy nights. Funny how something as humble as potato flakes could feel like a proper meal when you needed it most. Baked salsify with cheddar crumbs was a dish from a time when vegetables had character, when dirt-covered roots with strange names were regulars at the table. Salsify, also known as oyster plant, grew easily in cooler climates and was dug from the ground with care, its long white taproot looking more like something from a witch's pantry than a grocery shelf. But peeled and boiled, it softened into something creamy and nutty, with a hint of the sea, hence the nickname. It was laid into buttered pans, topped with breadcrumbs and sharp cheddar cheese, then baked until golden and bubbling. This was not a dish for guests. It was quiet food that tasted better than it looked. In farmhouse kitchens, it was served as a side or sometimes as the main course when meat was scarce. Supermarkets do not stock it, and few people even know its name. But for those who remember, this dish was a lesson in not judging a food by its first appearance. Beneath the dirt was something worth savoring. Spam and egg scramble was one of those 10-minute dinners that showed up again and again when times got lean. You diced up a can of Spam, fried it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then scrambled in a few eggs with onions if they were around. It all came together fast, filled your plate, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. Spam was a pantry staple for a reason. Cheap, shelf-stable, and surprisingly versatile. The old cookbooks were full of ways to stretch it into something that felt like a real meal. Toss in eggs, and suddenly, dinner looked good enough to serve without apology. It was salty, hearty, and loaded with that familiar taste of making do with what you had. Families leaned on quick meals like this because they worked. 10 minutes on the stove, a hot plate in front of everyone, and dinner was done. No one claimed it was fancy, but when your pantry was empty and the paycheck still days away, it tasted like a small victory. Funny how those simple, practical meals stuck with us. They filled the gaps and filled us up. There was a time when dinner didn't come from a drive-thru or a frozen box. It came from whatever was on hand. In kitchens where budgets were tight and grocery trips were limited, a humble combination of eggs, milk, flour, and butter could transform into something that filled bellies without emptying wallets. So how was egg sauce on saltines made? Hard-boiled eggs were mashed into a simple white sauce, thickened just enough to spoon over a stack of saltine crackers. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and cheap enough to buy by the dozen. A basic white sauce, made from milk, flour, and butter, was the foundation of countless Depression-era and post-war meals, stretching ingredients without overpowering them. Crackers, those were always in the pantry, whether for soup, snacks, or in this case, an entire meal. Families who couldn't afford fresh bread every day turned to saltines as a substitute, their crisp texture adding just enough bite to an otherwise soft dish. It may not have been the most exciting dinner, but it was warm, filling, and familiar. Kids ate it without fuss. Parents appreciated how far it stretched, and for those who grew up on it, the taste is forever linked to simpler times. Stuffed chicken rolls. Don't you dare confuse these with Mickey D's chicken nuggets. Stuffed chicken rolls are the dinner of every kid's dream, 'cause who wouldn't want this cheesy goodness instead of some plain old broccoli soup? Imagine thin-sliced chicken breasts pounded to tender perfection, and then filled with a savory mixture of seasoned ground ham and melty cheese. Stuffed chicken rolls are a great way to elevate a simple chicken breast, and they're perfect for a special occasion or a fancy weeknight dinner. They're surprisingly easy to make, so don't be intimidated by their fancy appearance. Despite its appeal, stuffed chicken rolls have become less common as people opt for simpler, quicker meals. This has to be by far one of America's greatest inventions, because even though it has vanished from dinner tables in the States, other nations around the world are devouring them. Few side dishes could bridge the gap between savory and sweet as effortlessly as corn pudding. A staple of Southern and Midwestern homecoming dinners, This dish combined farm-fresh simplicity with a rich, custard-like texture. Families often served it alongside roasted meats or holiday spreads, where its golden hue and delicate sweetness made it a comforting favorite. Whether fresh off the cob in the summer or canned in colder months, it was inexpensive and widely available. This recipe used basic pantry staples, butter, milk, eggs, and a touch of sugar, to create a dish that felt indulgent, despite its humble ingredients. Baking was the preferred method, allowing the custard to set while keeping the kernels tender. Some families swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others used deep casserole dishes to achieve that perfect golden crust. Recipes varied. Some included a splash of vanilla, others added a pinch of nutmeg. But the result was always a creamy, spoonable side that paired with almost anything. As processed cornbread mixes and quick-fix alternatives took over, traditional corn pudding was left behind. But for those who remember its warm, velvety bite, it's a dish worth bringing back. Corned beef hash from the can was one of those pantry miracles that turned a tin of meat and potatoes into a hot, filling dinner without much fuss. You sliced open the can, dumped the hash into a hot skillet, and let it crisp up around the edges until it was golden and ready to eat. You could fry an egg on top if you had one, but even plain, it did the job. This meal came straight from those old cookbooks that knew exactly how to stretch groceries and fill a plate fast. Corned beef hash was salty, hearty, and packed enough flavor to make up for how simple it was. It fed families during tight times, filled lunchboxes, and showed up on the table when there was not much else to work with. It might not have been fancy, but it was practical. And back then, practical meals were king. These dinners got everyone fed in under 10 minutes, with nothing wasted and no one left hungry. Funny how even canned food like this turned into something that stuck around in people's memories. Sour cream and onion-fried cabbage cakes were born from boredom. You can only eat boiled cabbage so many ways before you start to rebel, even during rationing. So clever hands found a way to reinvent the leftover greens, chopped finely, mixed with mashed potatoes, onion, and a scoop of sour cream, then pan-fried until crisp and golden. What emerged was somewhere between a latke and a hush puppy, tender in the middle and whispering with steam. These little cakes were served plain with applesauce or next to whatever protein was available, though they could hold their own as a meal. You could smell them cooking from outside the house, especially in winter when anything fried seemed like a gift from the heavens. These days, cabbage has gone back to being either raw in salads or lost in a soup pot. But once, it was the star of the skillet, crisping in bacon grease and proving that even leftovers could become legends. Gooseberry glazed pork chops with fried breaded okra was a dish that danced on the line between sweet and sharp. The gooseberries, sour and green when fresh, were cooked down with sugar into a tangy glaze that clung to the seared pork like a second skin. The meat, often from a thin chop or shoulder cut, was browned hard in a cast-iron skillet before being finished in the glaze, soaking up that lip-puckering sweetness. Beside it came okra, sliced, dredged in cornmeal and fried until golden. The outer crust crunched while the inside stayed soft and sticky, a texture only Southerners knew how to love. Gooseberries grew wild near fences and barn edges, and once they ripened, they went into everything from pies to pork. These days, you will rarely see them outside of specialty markets, and most folks would not know what to do with them anyway. But this dish was a reminder that flavor used to be chased, not just bought. And when it landed on your plate, it tasted like a southern summer in full bloom. Mid-century America had a love affair with convenience, and nothing sold homemakers on a recipe faster than a catchy advertising campaign. In the 1960s, Wesson Oil promoted a dish that promised flavor, affordability, and, of course, a little Wessonality. It started with ground beef, one of the most budget-friendly proteins of the era, mixed with canned green beans and tomato soup, then topped with a generous handful of crushed potato chips. A little crunch, a little sauce, and a whole lot of practicality. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times. Just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. Salmon and canned pea toasts were how you made pantry food look halfway fancy when the clock and your energy ran out. You took canned salmon, mashed it with mayonnaise, stirred in some peas, and spread it thick over hot toast. That was dinner. It sounds simple now, but when fresh meat was scarce or paychecks were tight, this was the kind of meal that kept families going. The old cookbooks were filled with little tricks like this, ways to stretch canned goods into something that almost felt special. Salmon from a can never fooled anyone, but the crunch of toast and the soft peas made it oddly satisfying. You might even see a sprinkle of pepper or a squeeze of lemon if someone was feeling bold. It came together fast, filled you up, and for those 10 minutes in the kitchen, it made you feel like you still had control over dinner. Sometimes that is all anyone needed. Which 1950s dinner would you bring back today? Drop your pick in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more retro comfort on the table.